So let's get started with introductions. My name is Heidi Waterhouse, and today I am joined by a panel of both experts and interested folks to talk about the problems and the opportunities of code documentation. So let's get started with our panelists. I want you to give a big welcome in your hearts because you're on mute to let's start with Omer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Omer Rosenbaum. I'm the CTO and one of the co-founders at Swim, who also sponsors this webinar. So basically, I've been devoting my life to code documentation in the past few years. In general, in Swim, we make all code easy to understand, either by allowing developers to ask questions about code or by making it easy to create documentation that we then keep up to date automatically as the code changes and help you find it when needed. So I've been thinking about documentation in many different cases in the past few years, and I'm really happy to be discussing it with you all.
Excellent. AB.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abiodun Olawode, AB for short. I'm a senior engineering manager at Factorial. But before that, I was on the DX team for a year, and I found that having good code documentation actually increases the productivity of devs by a huge gap. So I'm here to tell you how to imbibe such culture in your developers.
Excellent. Ryan.
Hey there, I'm Ryan McKenna. I'm a staff software engineer at RVO Health, the company behind Healthline and several other products. In addition to my responsibilities as engineering leader, I also co-chair our Disability Employee Impact Group. I'm really excited to be here. Code documentation is an extension of communication best practices, particularly in large distributed organizations, and we can always benefit from enhancing our ability to communicate our ideas more effectively.
Excellent. Hila.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Hila Fish. I'm a senior DevOps engineer, and I really love documentation. I think this is part of our day-to-day. Whether we are trying to fix or solve something, we will always try to find references and something that will help us achieve whatever we need. And I believe that we should do the exactly same thing for our code that we write. So we need to help others achieve whatever they want to do and help our team members with understanding what's going on. And I think this is part of the things that we will cover here in this panel. So I'm really happy to discuss it all.
That sounds great. So let's start with the first question. And it's a big one, a big gnarly one. What makes good code documentation? Let's start with Ryan.
So when I think of good code documentation, it's almost self-describing. I want to be able to see this code, and the documentation should just make sense with it. I want to understand what it should be doing, and I want to understand all the parts of this application or process, anything it touches. Sometimes we can even talk about business logic just to make it a little bit spicier.
I think the business logic thing is an interesting problem. Like, how far out does code documentation extend? What do you think, Omel?
So I agree with Ryan. I think business logic is one example of things that are not included in the code. And when something is not included in the code, you can't understand it, even if the code is really written in a clean manner or by someone who is very experienced. Still, it's just not there. You don't know that you added this condition for a specific client on a specific occasion. So I think good code documentation always explains the things you can't understand from the code. Also, I would say that good code documentation has to be up to date. And we all know that because we've all seen documentation that is outdated. We've all been led in the wrong direction following after reading something that was outdated. So I think it's another key factor. And also it should be easy to find. Otherwise, it doesn't help, even if it's written in a perfect manner.
Hila.
I really think that the code documentation should help us understand what's happening in the code and why we chose to do things in a certain way. And whenever we don't have the other context, like the business logic, then there should be a link or like a reference in the README of anything else that is not covered. So the code documentation should be concise and clear and really help me understand, and anyone that read it, help understand what's going on there, just to be able to do my job in terms of what's going on in the code. And if I need to do anything else, like understand why this was decided to do like this or that, then we need another reference to see, to have the full picture, basically.
And AB, what do you think makes good code documentation?
There's a Chinese aphorism that I always find very useful for this, and it says that the faintest ink is more powerful than the strongest memory. I see code documentation as that ink that helps us to not rely on other people's memory. So I shouldn't see it and have to find someone who can recall something to actually help me understand it. I should see it and it should just be clear and make sense. And as Omar said, it should be up to date, because if it's not and it's clear, it's just clear misinformation. So clear and up to date.
That's really beautiful. I love thinking of it that way. So Omar, you mentioned something about being able to find it. And let's talk about that a little bit. Like, how do you find documentation in code?
So there are a few ways, I guess. One way is to consider code comments, right? So usually these are snippets of lines of documentation within the code, and they appear next to code. And usually they're good at explaining a specific thing, like what I did in this very specific line, right? And this is a pretty easy kind of documentation to find. It becomes harder when you try to ask a question about things you don't even know where they reside in the code, or when the document describes a flow across multiple places. So one of the things that I guess most organizations do is search. And now we're gradually moving from lexical search, like searching for keywords, to perhaps using generative AI and LLMs to ask in natural language over documentation. What we also do in Swim is provide code icons next to relevant code lines that have corresponding documentation. So even if the documentation is not a code comment, you can still see that this relevant part of the code is referenced in one or more documents, and you get the link to that document.
How about you, AB? I liked what you said about like trying to track down the person who has the memory. Like, how do you make sure that people can find the documentation that exists?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing would be having comments, doc strings that help to describe. And so they could just search through the base to find what they need. Also, one thing is that some people do not actually put down everything that you need at a point. So as Hila said earlier, sometimes there could be links that lead you outside the code base itself. So sometimes you could even find that what you need is in a PR description or a comment. It's not even in the code base, and there's no way to know. So sometimes you just can't tell, except you have a certain way to search. You just have to find it somehow, like check for strings or the method name, signatures to guide you on how.
Ryan.
Yeah, so I'm glad we're talking about code comments, because I think that sometimes people get in their head a little bit about how a code comment is supposed to be used, when it's, as long as you use it, it's useful. And one of my favorite parts about code comments, everyone's been working through a feature that they maybe are kind of muscling their way through for the first time. And they're researching, you've got like 40 browser tabs open. At the end of the day, you're like, okay, the feature's done. One of the most useful things to do is go through each of those tabs. And if this was a useful page, copy that, put it in the comment, and just leave it there. You know, it leaves your breadcrumbs of how you solved this problem without actually having to be really descriptive and explicit. If I see a code chunk that has a line to an article, it's like, well, they probably got this from there, and there's a reason this article was written. And that kind of just leaves enough of a trail. If you don't want to be that descriptive, it can be very helpful. It's an underutilized method, I think, for code comments.
I really like that, the sort of dump your memory before you forget it, before it gets flushed. How about you, Hila?
I would say, first of all, I just want to refer to what Ryan said. I'm not sure that I'm agreeing with this, because the fact that your logic works in a certain way doesn't mean it works for everyone. So maybe others wouldn't really understood why you put it there, because their logic works differently. And then maybe it will even throw them off route from what they wanted to do because of that. So I would say before, and this leads me to what I wanted to say at the beginning, for me, it's a matter of culture of the company, because let's say we have different types of documentation in the company. One knowledge base for X, sometimes README in the repositories. We need to enact a culture of, okay, where do we document what? So what goes to the README? What goes to the knowledge base? Because if so, then we will definitely have a mess of where do we search things. But if we know exactly what to put where, then there is a certain order to things, and then we know exactly where to search things.
Yes. So we got a couple audience questions, and I want to sort of throw out whoever wants to answer this one. How do you do the handover from code documentation to what you're talking about, the knowledge bases and the customer facing documentation? Like, at what point does something have to transition out of the code?
I can answer. I would say whenever it's too difficult, let's say whenever it exceeded 2 lines. So if it's too complicated to explain, take it to a KB to explain the reasoning, intentions, in order for you to really defend the decision of what you're gonna talk about. So if it's easy to explain, put it in a doc string like X, but if not, put it elsewhere. I can give an example. So I created a module in Terraform, which is an opinionated module for creation of an IAM role, and the role gets created with an inline policy, like as a default. Why did I do that? Because inline policies are attached to the role. Whenever you delete the role, the inline policy goes with it. So this is like the main thing. But if someone doesn't know what an inline policy is, then I link to AWS documentation to get more context. But the first thing is just to explain the immediate reasoning, and I was able to do it in a sentence. And if you want to read more, go read in AWS documentation. But if I wasn't able to explain it in one sentence, I would definitely link to a README of the entire module and say, hey, read the full explanation there. So this is that was my take, basically.
And Ryan, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, so I think that largely it depends on your audience to a degree. But to expand a little bit more on what Hila had said, really, there's a part where you have shared terms, shared definitions of something. You know, if I've got a comment that in this moment, you need to know about what a policy is, yeah, you should probably link to this policy document that has that there. And since that term is used in multiple code bases or multiple repositories, that should be in the knowledge base. Like that should be there so that everyone can start there. And then if there's any references back to it, and then way you can kind of keep the code lean with all of the explanations. There's a moment where you have to kind of read your own comments and say, if I had just looked at this for the first time, do I have everything I need to understand this? And add some references, if not.
I would like to add something.
Mm-hmm.
There is this, I think it's a way of actually coding, which is called DDD, documentation driven development. And I'm like a big advocate for that, because if you put your thoughts down, you are saying, I think I can do this via path A, path B, and path C, but I choose B for this reason. So that means in the code, you just see B, you don't know why. But if you go to probably anywhere that you choose in Factorial, we use Notion. If you go there, you would see path A, path B, path C, and this is why we chose B. So it helps you to actually improve it if need be. So I think that if you do DDD, it's easier to separate all of those things that do not need to be in the code, and you can just do the code and have a link to the doc that has everything that you need and all explanations.
Mm-hmm.
To add on top of what AB just said, I think that the same applies for documenting a feature right after you implemented it, because inevitably you probably didn't implement it exactly as you planned to because you found some things along the way. And then when you end up describing what you did, especially for the person who is going to perform the code review, for example, I know people and it happened to me personally as well. You document what you did, and then you're like, oh, wait, because I explained it to myself, I found that actually there was one case I didn't really pay attention to, even if I documented before, like the plan or design of what I'm going to do. So yeah, in general, when you document something in proximity to the time you finished implementing or started implementing, in the case of TDD, it can actually help the actual implementation.
Definitely. It's
That
like a
makes,
duck, like
go ahead.
the duck. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Or a rubber duck.
Oh, rubber duck.
The difference with the rubber duck is that it stays for others to enjoy afterwards. Unless your rubber duck also writes it for you.
So speaking of writing it for you, we are all watching this wave of AI automation and auto completion, and we're not sure how it's going to work out. But do we think that AI and LLMs are going to help us write code documentation? Is that a thing that we can count on, or is code documentation too quirky and based on what we're doing? Let's go with AB.
Okay, so let's see Copilot as an example. So it's able to actually generate blocks and parts of code based on the context that you provide. So if we can have something similar that can actually analyze a code's logic and then tell you exactly how it works, what it does, it would be amazing. For me, I think that it wouldn't only save time, but it helps to keep things up to date. As the code is evolving, it's also changing. However, that being said, I do think that we are still at the point where after the generation, a human eye still needs to look at it in order to tweak some things. That's where I think that we are. I don't think I would say, update it automatically, just go, go, go. No, I would prefer to be there and still take a look and tweak some things just in case everything is not 100%. So I think it would help, but I don't think we're at the 10 over 10 point yet.
Hila.
I think that, yeah, the same as we don't take a code blindly that ChatGPT wrote for us and put in our code and integrate it. Same goes for any documentation that it will help us write. So if it's ChatGPT, if it's a Copilot, whatever, we need to examine what's going on there. Sometimes it will be spot on. Sometimes it will be just a pile of a word that I can't say here. And we just need to see that it really serves us, because at the end of the day, all of these tools are here to serve us. So sometimes they do it perfectly, sometimes not. So we are still the reason why AI wouldn't replace us is because we still have us and our judgment that is very, very needed in order to make sure that what they do, these tools can really help us.
Ryan.
Yes, so I think it's actually a yes and situation where we obviously someone should be reviewing everything that AI puts out, especially when it comes down to code bases that have real user impacts. That's just a reviewing good stewardship kind of process. But to talk about like design-driven development for a minute here, I think there's actually a really amazing paradigm switch that can happen when you use tools like Copilot, where I start a file and instead of me writing the code that I want to put in it, I can start a comment and say, this file does this, and suddenly it will suggest this. And obviously you don't want to use it for very complex things. It's great for, okay, I need a small function to do exactly this and this, and spit out something really small for this, easy to review, use it for chunks. But I find that to be a great accelerator, and I think that that's only going to get better. And I'm hoping that that actually pushes us to an environment where we are more used to writing comments first and actually leveraging AI to help us scaffold more complex operations in our code bases.
That's an interesting way to think about it, that the AI prompt itself is a kind of documentation.
Yeah, and it's just that space of the scaffold here is, there's 100 ways to write a function, but maybe we should take some of that choice away from the person who's staring at the blank screen and make the choices matter more in small pieces that are really context-based.
Yeah. Did you have something to add, Omer?
Yeah, so I agree with the others, so I try not to repeat what has been said and just add to that. So I think two other interesting things to note. One that is, I think, already being used by many developers or technical writers is help with the linguistic aspects of writing documentation. It's still writing. Not everyone enjoys writing. Not all developers liked or majored in I know English culture and historical writing maybe, and especially for engineers whose English is not their first tongue, it might make sense that giving them an AI tool to help writing may at least give us more confidence in writing documentation. So this is one thing that I think is already used either with Copilot for markdowns or many other tools to do that. And I think the more interesting part is there is always a question about what's important to document, right? We started with it. And I think the better AI tools become, the better they will be in describing the code and what the code does for you, either when you ask it on the fly or to help you create documentation. And we, for example, have worked a lot on that as part of Swing. But then there is always the part that no AI would be able to understand from code because, again, it doesn't exist in code. But it means that AI frees the developers to add their own unique knowledge about the business logic and things not in the code because AI has taken the work to write all the things that can be understood from code.
I think that really makes a lot of sense. And I like the idea of using AI as an accessibility boost. A couple times we've mentioned sort of the blank page or the difficulty of getting started writing. So why is it, do you think, developers struggle with writing documentation? Like, what makes writing this hard? Is it just language or experience, or they don't know what the criteria for success is? Gila.
I would say all of the above at a certain point, because I would assume that it starts out of, oh man, I don't have the time or I don't have the power to sit and invest in documentation, just want to work, because they don't consider it as work. So again, I'm gonna mention this word again, culture. So it is a matter of culture. You need to really understand that documentation is part of the job. Because same as we really need API documentation, for example, whenever we write feature and we want our users to use the features, why not use the same logic when we want to help our colleagues? Because I want them to know how to use whatever internal system that I wrote. So here you go, this is documentation, this is how you use it. And I know because I did it myself, I wrote a system, and because of the documentation that I wrote for it, then they will really be able to both adopt it and also be encouraged to use it, because they say, oh yeah, it's exactly my use case, or it sounds like something that I could utilize, etc. So I think that the same understanding that the fact that API documentation for our users, our clients, our customers is like mandatory whenever we write features, the same has to be applied on our day-to-day whenever we write stuff internally.
So we need to set documentation as part of the criteria for being properly done. AB,
Exactly.
You look like you had something to say about that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was planning to say, because I think the real problem is how we define done. What is done? Because it's interesting, it brings joy for you to actually think about a solution and then implement it and ship. So for you, oh, it works, it's done. But no, it's done and it is well documented, that's done. So we need to shift our mindset from done being it works to done being it works and it's well documented. So I think that will be a huge shift for us.
Ryan, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so when I think of why some of this is challenging, I might have an interesting different take on this a little bit. So there's definitely the time aspect. It takes a lot of time, and depending if you have the time or not, you'll make different choices with it. But I think there's something else with this. When we think of like when we're writing code, there's a lot of concept around the idea of you need like independent focus time. You know, you need to have like an hour or two. Nothing gets done in 20 minutes, right? So you have a bunch of meetings, you have 20 minutes between the next meeting or not, like you're not going to write code because the context switch that requires you need to kind of engage that kind of workload process. And I think documentation, in the way we're describing it, where we're writing it for audiences and for other people using more of the linguistic touch, I actually think it's kind of a different context. It's a different muscle than the muscle that it takes to sit down and just write code for yourself from this very specific hyper-focused space. And I think that muscle is something that needs to be trained and worked on, and that takes a lot of time and effort. So I think that there's not just the time and everything in that, it's also it's a practice that needs to be cultivated, part of the culture aspect. And it's something that we need to start valuing a little bit more.
And incentivizing.
And incentivizing, yeah.
Yeah, like I think that's a big part of it, is like we may punish people for not doing it, but do we reward them for doing it? Omel.
Right. I think to add on what Ryan just said, I agree that it's a muscle, and I think that many engineers have never had the desire to develop that muscle. I mean, again, it wasn't their first choice in school, probably literature or writing for most of us, right? And so for some, it's just not something they're used to doing because they never really took the time to do it. What I found to be very helpful for people who are starting to write documentation is to help them avoid the blank canvas problem by giving a start. And the start could be throughout and sort of an interview, like just okay, what's important to understand? Let's write headings. And when you have headings, like literally headers within the document, it's so much easier for them because they know what they need to write each time. Another trick that we found to be really useful is when you start from the code, because you've just written code, right? So you know your code. If you just go through the code and find the relevant places and put them or references to them in a document, then you know what you want to describe, why you did certain things, the relationships between different things. And it's also starting from something concrete, in this case, the code, rather than a blank page, which scares everyone out.
Yeah. So we've had several audience questions that center around documentation freshness or relevance. How is it that we can make sure that things are not only documented, but the documentation stays accurate to the code that it's documenting, and that there isn't a lot of drift? Omer, I feel like you may have an answer for that.
Sure. So actually, that's the first problem we set to solve when we created Swim. We found that I think, the fundamental problem of documentation, because when you know your documentation that you put so much effort into writing, and it might not be the easiest thing to do, is going to become outdated, it feels like working on something that doesn't make sense. So our approach to it is actually to test on every change to the code that all the code that is referenced in documents is still up to date, and then either make the changes automatically when the code changes, or in some extreme cases when there is big refactoring, notify the developer who made those changes, look, this document is now outdated due to the changes, update it now as part of the pull request. And we found that this process makes much more sense than any other alternative we tested. For example, some organizations have like this documentation day every once in a while where they read through lots of documentation and try to find what's relevant, what's not. It's really hard and time consuming and not really effective. But I think helping with automating it and also enforcing it in a way that is convenient and makes sense as part of a pull request makes sense here.
That makes sense. Ryan.
Yeah, so you kind of have to have a process for it at the end of the day. So at some point, you want to keep it in code because developers really only want it in code. We're a little stingy about where we want to actually write our documentation sometimes. Is that right? I don't know. We could have a debate about that. But at the end of the day, even the best processes around is it in code, things will change in the business. The business logic isn't in code a lot. And so that's the part where you kind of just have to have a process that says, all right, every 2 weeks, every month, whatever works for your team, let's just have a few hours or an hour. So we just kind of look through this and say, this still makes sense. And if not, flag some things to be updated. And it doesn't have to be done in the moment, but you kind of need to keep a track of it. You can't change things you're not measuring. So you just kind of have to start paying attention to it more frequently than you might be doing at the moment.
Hila.
I would say at first, I mean, if you're not using Swim and you don't have a proper tool to address the automation, at least set some priorities, let's say, because you can't go over all documentation all the time. So at least go over the documentation that is guild facing, the department facing, that a lot of users use. And then make sure these documentations are mostly, not mostly, but all the time up to date, because you know that a lot of people depend on it. Again, same as API documentation, that you have a lot of users, a lot of clients all over the world, hopefully, that uses this documentation. So focus first and have a process for making sure this documentation is up to date. And then if you have, documentation only for your team, okay, so assign someone that is responsible for that documentation because they are the most knowledgeable about that system, etc. But at least have priorities of which documentation you pay attention to, because some documentation are very, very important for a lot of processes that goes around in the company that you work for.
AB?
Okay, so I agree with what everyone has said. I think they've pretty much covered a lot, but there's something that I have found that works. And it's funny, but I would say it works. It's the concept of answer with a link. So anytime anyone asks a question, answer with a link. 3 things can actually happen. It's either you go there, find the documentation, and it's not there. So maybe a person says, how do I use this? Do not say, you use this by doing ABC. Find the doc and then send the link. So you may actually go there and see that it's not there. So then you have to create it so that you can send the link. Second thing is you go there, it's there, but it's not up to date. So you have to update it because you have to respond with a link. So this way, everyone defaults to the doc as the source of truth. Everyone knows that we don't come and say, oh, you do A by doing B, C, D. No, we just send you somewhere. So it then builds this culture of the documentation is actually the default. We don't think that AB will come tell you how it works. And that way you can keep it up to date, aside the AI and other processes that everyone has mentioned.
That's very elegant. I like that. Is there a time that you have been looking for documentation somewhere and you haven't found it? Like, where do you start looking for documentation when you need it? Let's start with Ryan.
I mean, it's a big, it depends on what I'm looking for, right? Am I looking for documentation about this exact code piece? And I'm like, okay, why is this working this way? Who made this decision? Git blame's a great way to find out. But you often will have to go to our knowledge base and look at the business logic first. Everything follows business logic, so you can usually work a path backwards from there. And that's kind of where I'll go from there. If there is documentation to start, I'll read that. If there's a link to go for, we'll go there. But if the person's still around and there's no docs for it, hopefully they'll answer some questions. And then you will document that answer.
That makes sense. Omel.
So personally, it changed a lot throughout the years. I started with a lot of Git blame, as Ryan mentioned, and code comments, and finding the relevant person with Git blame was my go-to. And then I found myself trying to find people who are not accessible for various reasons, like they left the company or maybe they're on vacation, and then it just wasn't good enough. So I tried to find information by either asking people or searching in knowledge bases. And I think we then shifted to find the documentation next to relevant code parts, as I mentioned before. And nowadays it's becoming more and more asking in natural language something that knows the current documentation as well as the code to help me find the answer as quickly as possible. And I think it's really interesting how this evolved so much in the last only few years. And it's a really new era also for finding information, not just documentation, but information in general.
And Hila.
I would say it divides to two. So whenever I'm searching for something outside, not right in my company, so I would usually look for references and then I will learn from the references. So just this week, I tried to do something with an open source library and wasn't able to find it in the proper documentation and found it in a PR, which, I mean, it's kind of obscure when you think about it. Like, it should be in the official documentation and not in a PR that someone wrote, but because they thought about the people that come after them and say, yeah, this is how I solved it, and I was able to utilize it. So I would usually go with references, and that's why whenever I write documentation, I always put references of examples of how to use whatever I'm talking about. And in terms of doing stuff internally, so what everyone here has mentioned by now, plus Slack. Slack became a very good source of knowledge search. Same goes for like Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is like Slack, internal Slack. So whenever I try to search or think about something, I'm like, probably I'm not the first or the only one that thought about it. I search in Slack and then I usually find the answer. And it's good that it searches in the entire Slack because we have a lot of channels. So.
Sounds like Slack Overflow.
Exactly.
AB.
Yeah, for me, I usually check the code base first. If I don't see anything there, the README. If I don't see anything there, PRs. I just go there, check the description. There's actually mostly something there. Then if I don't see anything there, I go to our base for docs, which is actually Notion. Most times you would find it there, but then Slack is like the last resort. If I don't find it in any of these places, you will definitely find it in Slack or someone in Slack who knows something about it.
It just emphasizes the fact that, again, this is the last time I'm gonna mention it, okay? I promise. Culture. Okay, so it's all comes back to that, because if anyone, like, all the company is already accustomed to writing in everything in Slack and document things there and not in other knowledge bases, then this is like my first way to go over there and search because of the culture. So it really always comes back to that, because whatever people go to and what is their go-to is how you should follow in order to do anything in the company that you work for.
I don't think there are too many times mentioned that the culture of a company changes how you look for things. I will say that we've started getting really cool tools. I've used one called Glean that collects everything, like your PRs and your Slack and your Notion and your Gmail, and it allows you to search all of them at once. And I'm like, oh, this is a thing that has been super useful for me, is the ability to say, look, I know this keyword exists somewhere, but I don't remember where I saw it, or I don't know all the places it exists. And that relates to an audience question we got. How do you manage the overlap and duplication of documentation for different audiences and across different systems? So this webinar is very specifically focused on code documentation, but code documentation keeps escaping out into API documentation and business logic. So I'm not going to make everybody answer if they don't want, but is there anybody who wants to address the sort of like duplication?
I'll take a stab at it. So we have a lot of private tools. We have a couple things that are public, and we're not exactly open APIs or anything, but we do have a lot of documentation that honestly gets duplicated depending on the audience sometimes. And we've had moments where we say, okay, well, this is here and it's also here, and sometimes it's there. What do we want to do about it? And we've kind of had moments where we realized sometimes it's just going to happen. Not that that's, give up on the solution. There's definitely lots of good ways to do it. But the reality is that sometimes you do need to have a different publicly accessible website for a different audience, and you might need to have a different one for a different external vendor. And the processes in which those get created might not be the same depending on your company. So you might have to figure out a way to manage both until you come up with a solution that is more reusable. At least duplicated documentation is documentation that exists.
It's true. All right. Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to give everybody a chance to wrap up and answer a question that we got from Jackie. Do you have any recommendations for books or articles to improve your documentation or communication? And let's, Ryan, you just made a face. Let's start with AB.
Oh, okay. So I would say that this was very interesting. And yeah, there's one thing that we keep hearing, which is culture. So we have to actually get to that point where we refer to doing this as how we do things. This is how we do things here. We actually do documentation. Our how we see done is that it works and it is well documented. This is how we do things. As it regards any articles, it's like AB is always about DDD, but there's this article about DDD. I think I'll find it and I'll put the link in
the channel. Yeah.
Also, there's one I found very, very interesting by Swim. Funny enough, yeah, it details the types of documentation, high level, low level, inline comments, and all of that. And it guides you on how to actually create this culture of documentation. I would also find that and put it in the chat.
Hila.
So let's start with a wrap up. I think, yeah, it's a vast topic, and I think that the most important thing about documentation to remember is that this is what helps you defend your decisions that you're making. So if you really put an effort in it, I think this will help in the long run. Whenever you have a project that you just implemented now, or a year from now, whenever you want to revisit projects and understand if this solution is what we need currently or not, we can go back the decisions that I can guarantee nobody will remember why those decisions were taken. If we have it covered in the documentation, we can see, and then we say, yeah, this is still our case, or no, it's not relevant anymore. We need to rethink this again. So that's about that. And just think about the documentation as a way to really always, you need to help. You need to help others. You need to help the future you whenever you want to go back to code that you wrote, and again, probably wouldn't remember what's going on there. So always aim to write documentation that will help either you or anyone around you. In terms of references, I don't have anything at the moment, but luckily for us, we have the Slack channel. So if I have anything, then I will post it there.
Ryan.
Yeah, so code documentation, I'm glad that we mentioned this in the same breath as communication, because code documentation is just an extension of how you communicate with your team. And software engineering is a team sport. So no amount of code documentation is going to be able to cover poor communication practices on a team. So if we're hoping to fix any of those issues there, my recommendation is actually to start with how you're talking to one another. Everything that we've discussed on this, no matter how much you have lean into language models or automatic code processes, rely on you to talk to the people at your team and to be good coworkers. So there's a lot of books about how to actually have really nice conversations with people, how to make people feel validated and make sure that you're communicating effectively. That was actually where I would focus your efforts if you're trying to solve a broader cultural issue with how we communicate with one another, because it all starts with that.
Yeah. And finally, Omel.
So first of all, I'd say it's really fun to talk with people who are passionate about documentation and knowledge sharing and have different ways of thinking about the problem that I've been thinking a lot about. And it's refreshing and exciting. And also I wanted to say, kudos to all of you who joined this session. And really, it's amazing. You already do so much in the fact that you're here, and you state that it's important to communicate well, as Ryan said it, with your teams, and to document and to make sure the right processes are in place. And even the fact you're thinking about it and trying to find the right processes is probably at least 80% of the way. And then you will eventually find the right tools after iterating, right? And you can read in some resources we'll share with you on Slack, or reach out to us. We'll all be happy to assist. But it's really amazing. And I find myself looking at the participant part here and say, wow, so many people care about documentation. And you made me happy. So thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great day, and feel free to join us on the Lead Dev Slack in the Effective Teams channel for any further follow-up. It was great to talk with you all. Later.